Recording. Welcome to Henry George Daily Devotional, episode 47. Um, we're going to respond to a user submitted question. Viewer submitted. Um, it actually wasn't in response to a particular episode, but it was just a question about Georgism from a friend. Uh, they were speaking to somebody else about Georgism, and somebody else said, and this is the someone. Someone then mentioned, well, big tech companies also absorb the benefits that technological improvements bring, instead of those benefits being passed down to the workers. And land value tax wouldn't affect that in the same way it would affect landlords. The person who my friend is thought that was an interesting point. How would we shift the computer technological gains from execs to laborers? I don't think a land value tax would get much dollars from tech companies for the land that data centers are built on, or on the wire infrastructure that these companies use, or anything like that. Feel free to this is my chief work. Um, yeah. So a quick word search of progress and poverty. Invention is mentioned 66 times. We could we could go through all of these. Um, The effect of inventions and improvements in the productive arts is to save labor. That is, to enable the same result to be secured with less labor, or a greater result with the same labor. But in a world where you can't escape landlords, it all gets absorbed eventually by the landlords. Yeah, so in general, in a land monopoly environment, in a land monopolized land, uh, those execs, mm, um, let's see. Suppose we're in a land monopolized by one lord of the land. Then those execs themselves do not benefit. Do not Are not the ones. Then those execs are how those then what those execs absorb from the workers are then in in turn absorbed by the lord of the land. If the companies themselves are, in practice, companies often, well, let's see. Um, in general, wages are depressed in a non-Georgist environment, or what was it? Environment. So, so even without considering, um, so even without considering technological innovations, the workers are not getting their fair share. This is because wages are offered in sort of discretized levels to persuade the more over a base wage, which is determined by how much money over a base wage. What's the better way? To persuade the best workers to compete for the best jobs. The base wage is ultimately determined by what the average laborer could make from working the marginal land, which is just the best unused land, which is just the land that can be used without having a rent to anyone. However, even this bottoms out, because right now, if I had to go work if I had to go work without relying on any owned land, meaning basically I have to go back out to Joshua Tree and start trying to farm Joshua trees or something. That would probably be a less than living wage. Like, I would literally die. So the other thing that pushes the base wage up is that um, landlords can't let the actual wealth producing population simply die. Does that make sense? I could go on. I could talk about this for lifetimes. One final comment. George was against patents. Patents are a form of artificial monopoly. They're often granted along with tech innovation. There's disagreement about abolishment or reform. I prefer abolish, but this I could talk about patents for another lifetime too. I'll stop there. That seems obvious. to. This might be, this is probably a bigger deal in the tech world than others. Final comment. Whilst tech companies in their day-to-day activity do not rely on a large footprint of land, nonetheless, much of their tools are sourced from land-dependent, well, all their tools are sourced from the land, because all wealth, therefore all capital, comes from working the land. And all of the land values surrounding a tech HQ go up, 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 and you may disagree, but it seems like having everyone return to office, i.e., be in the same physical space, seems to be quite valuable and to these companies. Alright, this is my monster response. Well. 12 minutes into our recording. Now to George. Where did we leave off? This is where we left off, in the middle of chapter 6. Uh-oh, did I not put the I on V there? Might need to look into that. Was episode 46, 36. Misdetailed with. Oh, hello, I forgot you were starting to stream. Oh, I should have pinged you probably. Well, that's okay. You can I like live typed the response. Okay, doesn't matter for me. I have the restream going. Yeah. If you want to watch me type that up more slowly and think it through a little bit, you can watch, the VOD or the YouTube video. But I am going to press on. Cool. Let me know if you disagree, if you see problems with it, if it's unclear, or if you are wholly persuaded. Right. Here we are. All right. Henry George Daily Devotional. We're back to the reading. Oh yeah, I could have included the law of wages in there. Or well, I guess we're about to get the official law of wages. Wages here. I'm gonna hit you with this. About to be re-derived by him live on the Henry George Daily Devotional. Schwab. Alright, here we go. Um, yeah, and like this law of wages was like sort of how I was trying to talk to Jonah at LA Indies about, he wants to unionize, he wants to be a socialist, he's, wants down with the big corporations. And I was like, yeah, I sympathize. A land value tax would fix that, as well as abolishing patents and IP rights. However, when I talked to Jonah the very first time and talked to him about Georgism, I had not radically I had not considered the radical suggestion of abolishing IP rights, which George himself does not advocate for. He advocates for a like um, 30-year uh, like IP kind of thing. Yeah, cool. 30 minutes. Okay. All right. 30 minute. 30 minute. Yeah, yeah. 30-year is what a lot of people say for IP rights. I don't know. 10 years seems more than enough for me, or 0 years also seems enough for me. Okay, but though all this is Henry George writing in Progress and Poverty. Finally, we're getting to it. This is gonna be the long record-setting episode today. But though all these circumstances which produce the differences in wages between occupations may be considered, remember we got 5 reasons that he gave for why wages um, can be slightly different. Um, between occupations may be considered as operating through supply and demand, they, or rather their effects, for sometimes the same cause operates in both ways, may be separated into two classes, according as they tend only to raise apparent wages, or as they tend to raise real wages, that is, to increase the average reward for equal exertion. The high wages of some occupations much resemble what Adam Smith compares them to, the prizes of a lottery, in which the great gain of one is made up from the losses of many others. This is not only true of the professions by means of which Dr. Smith illustrates the principle, but is largely true of the wages of superintendents in mercantile pursuits, as shown by the fact that over 90% of the mercantile firms that commence business ultimately fail. Mercantile, I know that has kind of a historical meaning too. I don't know if he means it more than just merchants. In this case, yeah, just merchants. I don't know. The higher wages of those occupations which can be prosecuted only in certain states of the weather, or otherwise intermittent and uncertain, are also of this class. Um, Yeah, this class is wages of superintendents, and this is the one where the gain of one is made up of the losses of from others. Um, while differences that arise from hardship, discredit, unhealthiness, etc., imply differences of sacrifice, the increased compensation for which only preserves the level of equal returns for equal exertions. Yes, if your job is easy and you get $10 for doing it, but my job is very, very hard and I get $20 for doing it, I have exerted much more than you. And so if you were to exert more, we would get the same result still. All these differences are, in fact, equalizations arising from circumstances which, to use the words of Adam Smith, make up for a small pecuniary gain in some employments and counterbalance a great one in others. Um, Pecuniary just meaning money, not necessarily evil. Usually it's always associated with something derogative. George continues. But besides these merely apparent differences, there are real differences in wages between occupations, which are caused by the greater or less rarity of the qualities required, greater abilities or skill, whether natural or acquired, commanding on the average greater wages. Now, these qualities, whether natural or acquired, are essentially analogous to differences in strength and quickness in manual labor, and as in manual labor, the higher wages paid the man who can do more would be based upon wages paid to those who can do only the average amount. So wages in the occupation requiring superior abilities and skill must depend upon the common wages paid for the ordinary abilities and skill. That was a key point. Um, if you're the absolute best burger flipper, you'll make a little bit more, than the ordinary burger flipper. If you are the absolute best surgeon, you'll make more than the ordinary surgeon. It is indeed evident from observation, as it must be from theory, that whatever be the circumstances which produce the differences of wages in different occupations, and although they frequently vary in relation to each other, producing, as between time, and place, greater or less relative differences, yet the rate of wages in one occupation is always dependent on the rate in another, and so on, down until the lowest and widest stratum of wages is reached, in occupations where the demand is more nearly uniform and in which there is greatest freedom to engage. Yes, this is the discretized pyramid of wages. That's my phrasing for it. There is this base level of labor, which is like go work with your hands with no tools, go pick berries effectively. And that is very uniform in what it requires from people, and it is very free to engage in. Um, Fishing, hunt, these basic sort of survival crafty kind of occupations. Um, that is the base rate. George continues. For although barriers of greater or less difficulty may exist, the amount. Oh, yeah, Patrick, you should just send your friend the Henry George Daily Devotional right here, right now. um, The amount of labor which can be determined in any particular pursuit is nowhere absolutely fixed. I wasn't paying attention during that sentence. Yes, the amount of labor is flexible. All mechanics could act as laborers. And I guess this term of laborer, I guess, is like a daily laborer. I'm a little confused why George would use this term. It's like a general category, but I think he just, I don't I don't know. And many laborers could readily become mechanics. I'm thinking of a laborer as like a picker, maybe, like a farm picker or something. All storekeepers could act as shopmen. Okay, I don't know what the difference in a storekeeper and a shopman is, but I'm assuming they're slightly different. And many shopmen could easily become storekeepers. Many farmers would, upon inducement, become hunters or miners, fishermen or sailors, and many hunters, miners, fishermen, and sailors know enough of fanning. I believe this is a transcription error. This should be farming to turn their bands to it on demand. I think this is another one. This should be hands to it on demand. I really probably. I was gonna say I should document the typos. We could make a note here. Fanning to turn their bands. One day somebody can fix all this. Farming to turn their hands. I'll have to make a file for found typos, but I'm not going to go back to the start here. In each occupation, there are men who unite it with others. Or who alternate between occupations, while the young men who are constantly coming in to fill up the ranks of labor are drawn in the direction of the strongest inducements and least resistances. Yeah, when I look at myself, I could become a much better programmer. I could redirect my efforts towards visual art, Or I could have stuck with math and physics, either teaching, or it'd be tough now to get into the research game because I'm so old and I left that behind. But I could teach, and then the other option for me is I could coach soccer. And of course I'm more fit for some of these than others, but that's what I could do. Yeah, would not really be able to teach music or literature, although I could teach George. Um, but at the base rate, I could also just become, a day laborer, as most of us could, but not all of us. And further, like my mom, she picked cotton as a little girl with her older brother, and then she became a pharmacist. And my uncle became a mechanical engineer. Uh, you didn't need me to tell you that people can change careers. And further than this, George writes, all the gradations of wages shade into each other by imperceptible degrees instead of being separated by clearly defined gulfs. Um, yes, I agree. I think it is helpful though when thinking of like okay, when you think of everyone's a farmer, okay, and they're all farming their own lands, okay, and one person wants to hire somebody to do this other job, go fight the lions or the wolves that are preying on our livestock, right? Dangerous job. You need to be strong, brave, high risk involved as well. So you're gonna need to offer like something more than the farmer's wage. Okay, so that's like farmer's wage plus epsilon, right? Um, and I don't even want to use epsilon, right? Because that's in math, that's meaning like this infinitesimal, like slightly more than amount, just to be like this amount is more than this amount, but just by the smallest possible amount of moreness. We want to use like a unit. It's like $1 more per hour or something, some unit more. Okay, and then suppose there's another job that comes up, which is like I don't know. I was assuming like a low tech world, so being the one to go out and fight wolves is pretty high demand. I guess you could imagine, you know, wanting a doctor next. So you're gonna need somebody who's just gonna spend their whole life researching and has to just sort of preferably be a very smart person. Um, Yeah, and this isn't going to be super great to compare because it's likely that person probably wouldn't have um, competed for the wolf hunting job. All right, suppose there's some other. So yeah, all right, let's forget the doctor one. Suppose there's some other job which is like, okay, now we need somebody to like go get water, and water is super far away and it's heavy or something. So it takes a lot of physical demand, but not as much as fighting the wolves. So if you offer the same amount that you want to pay for the wolf hunter, well, all the wolf hunters are just going to stop hunting wolves and they're going to become water carriers, right? Because they're strong and fit and they can do that and they'll get paid more than being just a standard day laborer or a farmer, I guess. So then, so we inserted like a job here that had middle demands. So then to get people to hunt wolves again, you're going to need to offer like 2 units, you know. That's why I think it's sort of helpful to think of these gradations. But yes, once you have like, if you have infinite jobs, infinite workers, infinite levels of, or of the demands for those jobs, there will be a very smooth, imperceptible degrees. The gulfs between the jobs will be hard to even see. But you can still see the extreme ends, right? Like nowadays, we have our surgeons, we have our lawyers, we have our burger flippers, and then we also have sports stars or movie actors. Anyway, the wages George writes, even of the poor paid mechanics are generally higher than the wages of simple laborers, but there are always some mechanics who do not on the whole make as much as some laborers. The best paid lawyers receive much higher wages than the best paid clerks, but the best paid clerks make more than some lawyers, and in fact, the worst paid clerks make more than the worst paid lawyers. Thus, on the verge of each occupation stand those to whom the inducements between one occupation and another are so nicely balanced that the slightest change is sufficient to determine their labor in one direction or another. Unless, like the American Medical Association says, there can only be X number of doctors per year. So even if you want to be a doctor, you can't unless you get one of those spots that I don't know exactly how they decide who gets the spots. It's like the number of residencies that the I don't know. It's something like that. Artificial restriction to free trade via the government, which is a costly thing to do in terms of wealth generation. Not saying it's always wrong, but I am saying it's always wrong. Thus, any increase or decrease in the demand for labor of a certain kind cannot, except temporarily, raise wages in that occupation above, nor depress them below the relative level with wages in other occupations, which is determined by the circumstances previously adverted to. I don't think adverted to is a typo. I just think it's an old word meaning referred to in speaking or writing, such as relative agreeableness or continuity of employment, etc. Yes. Any increase or decrease in demand for labor of a certain kind cannot, except temporarily, raise wages in that occupation above nor depress the relative level of wages in other occupations. And that's determined as previously we referred to, talked about, adverted to, such as agreeableness, continuity of employment. The other reasons, I actually quickly jotted them down in my précis of progress and poverty, which were agreeableness, like difficulty, skill required, constancy, is it like seasonal or something, the responsibility when you have that position that falls on you, and the risk were the five. You could probably break those down different ways, add other ones, subdivide in other ways, but anyway. George continues, even as experience shows where artificial barriers are imposed to this interaction, such as limiting laws, guild regulations, the establishment of caste, etc., they may interfere with, but cannot prevent, the maintenance of this equilibrium. They operate only as dams, which pile up the water of a stream above its natural level, but cannot prevent its overflow. Uh, Thus, although I wonder if he's. I mean, I would now refer you to reading his essay on rum power, which is how when there are tariffs or limitations on the selling of rum and alcohol, uh, the effects of that, and how suddenly there's this whole faction in politics called rum power that is enabled by the tariffs and restrictions on rum, and then at what point it incentivizes bootlegging and such so forth, and thus hence ergo follow through the ramifications of all that. George continues, thus, although they may from time to time alter in relation to each other as the circumstances which determine relative levels change, yet it is evident that wages in all strata must ultimately depend upon wages in the lowest and widest stratum, the general rate of wages rising or falling as these rise or fall. Now, the primary and fundamental occupations upon which, so to speak, all the others are built are evidently those which procure wealth directly from nature. This is our base job. Hence, the law of wages in them must be the general law of wages. And as wages in such occupations, I mean, George does do this thing a lot where it's like, here's how things work in the very simplest formation of society, and then he just says it holds um, at a higher scale. And I must confess that, that does not need be the case. Lots of times in systems, you can start up something, and then the way you keep it going can be somewhat different. Um, I I mean, I don't. I mean, I hugely agree with all of what George writes, but I do sometimes think you could be unpersuaded when he makes some of these leaps. Um, I always try to. I remember several examples of functions in math when I studied it, where these were examples where you'd be very tempted um, to uh, come to a conclusion of a pattern after you see the function run for like n plus 1, n plus 2, n plus 3, n plus 4, n plus 5, and it's always turning out in this patterned way. And you're like, okay, clearly the pattern is this. But then after you do it, then the professor's like, uh-huh, that's what you guys think? Well, now let's do it with, n plus 7, and then it breaks. And you're like, oh no. And I don't mean the actual like proper way of producing by induction, doing it in the general sense, like n and then given n, or f of n and then given f of n, you use that to then do f of n plus 1, and then you're like, well, it holds then. I mean, I guess the example was she just like I remember the professor showed us this function. She, did it for f of 1 and got a result. The answer was 2. Then f of 2 and the result was 3. F of 3, the result was 4. F of 5, the result was 6. F of 7, the result was 8. And so you're like, oh, okay, so it always just adds 1. And then she's like, oh, well, here, when we do f of 9, we get 12. And then when we do f of 10, we get 16. And it's like, oh, shit. Anyway, that was a big tangent. All right. So George does say uh, the base the base working job, the primary and fundamental occupations upon which, so to speak, all others are built, are evidently those which procure wealth directly from nature. Hence, the law of wages in them must be the general law of wages. Okay. And as wages in such occupations clearly depend upon what labor can produce at the lowest point of natural productiveness to which it is habitually applied, therefore wages generally depend upon the margin of cultivation, or, to put it more exactly, upon the highest point of natural productiveness to which labor is free to apply itself without the payment of rent. Again, rent is what is it is the excess value. Well, you guys know what rent is in this situation, but it is the excess value produced. I'm trying to define it in a non sort of circular way here with wages, but I guess you don't need wages. The produce given a fixed amount of labor, applying it to one piece of land, produces X amount. If it produces more than that on another piece of land, that amount more would be the rent, assuming the first piece of land that we based it off of was marginal land. So obvious is this law that it is often apprehended without being recognized. It is frequently said of such countries as California and Nevada that cheap labor would enormously aid their development, as it would enable the working of the poorer but most extensive deposits of ore. A relation between low wages and a low point of production is perceived by those who talk in this way, but they invert cause and effect. It is not low wages which will cause the working of low-grade ore, but the extension of production to the lower point which will diminish wages. If wages could be arbitrarily forced down, as has sometimes been attempted by statute, the poorer mines would not be worked so long as richer mines could be worked. But if the margin of production were arbitrarily forced down, as it might be were the superior natural opportunities in the ownership of those who choose rather to wait for future increase of value than permit them to be used now, wages would necessarily fall. Yes. If people just own a bunch of land and they say, well, no, let's not mine this yet, they force wages down. The demonstration is complete. The law of wages we have thus obtained is that which we previously obtained as the corollary to the law of rent, and it completely harmonizes with the law of interest. It is that wages depend upon the margin of production or upon the produce which labor can obtain at the highest point of natural productiveness open to it without the payment of rent. This law of wages accords with and explains universal facts that without its apprehension seem unrelated and contradictory. It shows that where land is free and labor is unassisted by capital, the whole produce will go to labor as wages. Where land is free and labor is assisted by capital, wages will consist of the whole produce less the part necessary to induce the storing up of labor as capital. Where land is subject to ownership and rent arises, wages will be fixed by what labor could secure from the highest natural opportunities open to it without the payment of rent. Where natural opportunities are all monopolized, wages may be forced by the competition among laborers to the minimum at which laborers will consent to reproduce. There it is. A living wage. It gets for we speak in the modern era of, oh, we need to pay these people a living wage. George, when he talks about a living wage, he says that is disgusting and way too little, and that is what, like, a literal living wage is what George is talking about. I'm conflating the terms. George here is talking about, like, would you work this job or would you rather die? And I mean, I would flip burgers for $2 and $1 an hour, rather than die. Although I would also be having secret meetings with all of my burger flipping friends to organize a revolution at that point too. Like Ricardo's law of rent, of which it is the corollary. Oh, did I? I didn't read this. Okay. This necessary minimum of wages, which by Smith and Ricardo is denominated the point of natural wages, and by Mill supposed to regulate wages, which will be higher or lower as the working classes consent to reproduce at a higher or lower standard of comfort, is, however, included in the law of wages as previously stated, as it is evident that the margin of production cannot fall below that point at which enough will be left as wages to secure the maintenance of labor. Yeah, if you don't pay them anything, they will not continue to work. Sometimes people talk about this. This is sort of the link to chattel slavery and wage slavery. Uh, you know, I guess the other thing, if people don't consent to work, the next choice you would have would be hitting them with a whip, right? I won't. I'll flip burgers for $2 or $3 an hour. After that, I wouldn't do it. But if my other option is sit around and do nothing, or if my other option is flip burgers and not get paid, or sit around and do nothing but get whipped and be put in jail, um, I guess I would flip burgers for nothing to avoid getting whipped. But again, I would be having secret meetings with my other burger flippers to organize a revolution, a rebellion. Like Ricardo's law of rent, of which it is the corollary, this law of wages carries with it its own proof and becomes self-evident by mere statement, for it is but an application of the central truth that is the foundation of economic reasoning, that men will seek to satisfy their desires with the least exertion. I did not remember how often George said this the first time I read it, but he says it a lot. Chatter says you could write a novel and title it "The Flip of the Burger." It's true. I'll put that in my other book title list. It includes "Look a Book" and "You're All Idiots." That was my other title. Actually, I have a few other ones too that I think about. Um, the average. See there, yeah. See, the average man will not work for an employer for less, all things considered, than he can earn by working for himself. Nor yet will he work for himself for less than he can earn by working for an employer. And hence the return which labor can secure from such natural opportunities as are free to it must fix the wages which labor everywhere gets. That is to say, the line of rent is the necessary measure of the line of wages. In fact, the accepted law of rent depends for its recognition upon a previous, though in many cases it seems to be an unconscious, acceptance of this law of wages. Remember that the Ricardo's law of rent was widely accepted by all the economists, but all the economists did not have the law of wages correct, according to George. But now George is saying that to believe in the law of rent, there's like an unconscious acceptance of the law of wages, that and then by implications, all these economists are not aware of that. George continues, what makes it evident that land of a particular quality will yield as rent the surplus of its produce over that of the least productive land in use is the apprehension of the fact that the owner of the higher quality of land can procure the labor to work his land by the payment of what that labor could produce if exerted upon land of the poorer quality. In its simpler manifestations, this law of wages is recognized by people who do not trouble themselves about political economy, just as the fact that a heavy body would fall to the earth was long recognized by those who never thought of the law of gravitation. It does not require a philosopher to see that if any country natural opportunities were thrown open which would enable laborers to make for themselves wages higher than the lowest now paid, the general rate of wages would rise, while the most ignorant and stupid of the placer miners of early California knew that as the placers gave out or were monopolized, not exactly sure what a placer is, wages must fall. Maybe these are just like claims. I don't know. It requires no fine-spun theory to explain why wages are so high relatively to production in new countries where land is yet unmonopolized. The cause is on the surface. One man will not work for another for less than his labor will really yield when he can go upon the next quarter section and take up a farm for himself. It is only as land becomes monopolized and these natural opportunities are shut off from labor that laborers are obliged to compete with each other for employment, and it becomes possible for the farmer to hire hands to do his work while he maintains himself on the difference between what their labor produces and what he pays them for it. All right, we're just going crazy today. We're gonna finish. Adam Smith himself saw the cause of high wages where land was yet open to settlement, though he failed to appreciate the importance and connection of the fact. In treating the causes of the prosperity of new colonies, Chapter 7, Book 4 of Wealth of Nations, he says, every colonist gets more land than he can possibly cultivate. He has no rent and scarce any taxes to pay. Looks like a transcription error. BB, he is eager, therefore, to collect laborers from every quarter and to pay them the most liberal wages. But these liberal wages, joined to the plenty and cheapness of land, soon make these laborers leave him in order to become landlords themselves, and to reward with equal liberality other laborers who soon leave them for the same reason they left their first masters. This chapter contains numerous expressions which, like the opening sentence in the chapter on the wages of labor, show that Adam Smith failed to appreciate the true laws of the distribution of wealth only because he turned away from the more primitive forms of society to look for first principles amid complex social manifestations, where he was blinded by a pre-accepted theory of the functions of capital, and yet, as it seems to me, by a vague acceptance of the doctrine which, 2 years after his death, was formulated by Malthus. If you want to read about, if you're a new viewer, listener of the Henry George Daily Devotional, we spent a lot of time talking about Malthus back in book 2, maybe book 1, book 2, I don't know. And it is impossible, George continues, to read the works of the economists who since the time of Smith have endeavored to build up and elucidate the science of political economy without seeing how over and over again they stumble over the law of wages without once recognizing it. Yet, quote, if it were a dog, it would bite them, end quote. Indeed, it is difficult to resist the impression that some of them really saw this law of wages, but, fearful of the practical conclusions to which it would lead, preferred to ignore and cover it up rather than use it as the key to problems which without it are so perplexing. I mean, yeah, after George, economists should have been out of a job. A great truth to an age which has rejected and trampled on it is not a word of peace, but a sword. A great truth to an age which has rejected and trampled on it is not a word of peace, but a sword. Perhaps it may be well to remind the reader, before closing this chapter, of what has been before stated, that I am using the word wages not in the sense of a quantity, but in the sense of a proportion. When I say that wages fall as rent rises, I do not mean that the quantity of wealth obtained by laborers as wages is necessarily less. Yeah, and this is a subtle point, right? Because we talk about, oh, we're all so rich now. We are, as a society. And anyway, I don't need to interrupt George more. As wages, I do not mean that the quantity of wealth obtained by laborers as wages is necessarily less, but that the proportion which it bears to the whole produce is necessarily less. The proportion may diminish while the quantity remains the same or even increases. This is very relevant to the tech innovation we started off with. If you have some kind of innovation that lets your workers be 10 times more productive, uh, you can keep their wages at the same amount, and their proportion has dramatically gone down. So the executives make a whole bunch more money, and if the executives are themselves renters, then it's all going to be sucked away from them too. If, George continues, the margin of cultivation descends from the productive point which we will call 25 to the productive point we call 20, the rent of all lands that before paid rent will increase by this difference, and the proportion of the whole produce which goes to laborers as wages will to the same extent diminish. But if, in the meantime, the advance of the arts or the economies that become possible with greater population have so increased the productive power of labor that at 20 the same exertion will produce as much wealth as before at 25, laborers will get as wages as great a quantity as before, and the relative fall of wages will not be noticeable in any diminution of the necessaries or comforts of the laborers, but only in the increased value of land, and the greater incomes and more lavish expenditure of the rent-receiving class. The rich get richer, and the working renters stay the same. And that's sort of a we're all just we're all just frogs as the water starts boiling. No, that doesn't work. Anyway. All right. I'm worn out. This is record-setting daily devotional. If you stuck with me, thank you. So long.